Hi, I'm Jen Clayman and welcome to my channel. This weekend I'm participating in the Victoria Marie Designs YouTube Masterclass Channel Hop. The students in this class are participating in this channel hop to showcase our new skills and to jumpstart our creative YouTube channels. Yay! Thanks so much for joining me and for joining all of us this weekend. After this video, please be sure to check out my fellow Masterclass students. Their YouTube channels are listed in the description box below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channels. We really appreciate the support. And just a little bit about me before we get started with this video. I'm a rabbi, teacher, maker, and seeker, looking for ways to express connections to Judaism and Jewish spirituality through creativity and exploration. Today, I'm sharing with you the beginning of a video series called Torah Study in the style of Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Enjoy! I'd like to start by telling you a story. In the fall and winter of 2018-2019, when my oldest son was in 4th grade, Harry Potter entered our lives. I had tried to read the books maybe 15 years before, but stopped in the middle of book 5. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe the books didn't speak to me then. I don't know. But this time, my son and I were going to read the books together. Together, because he has dyslexia. And we knew that the print books were going to be too difficult for him, but he was ready for the content. And so we decided to listen together to the Jim Dale audiobooks. And wow, what an experience. My son and I already enjoyed going to superhero movies together, but Harry Potter took things to a whole other level. At home in the afternoons, after school, after he did his homework, we would sit and listen to the books. I would curl up on the couch with a blanket and he would play with Legos and we would listen. A few times we stayed up listening well into the evening, past his bedtime. For Hanukkah, he and his younger brother got wands and Hogwarts robes and scarves. And sometimes he would listen to the books while wearing the costumes and waving the wand around, mimicking spells. And then when we would finish each book, we watched the corresponding movie. We also took quizzes to see which houses we're in. And it turns out we are both Gryffindors, which surprised me. For me, I thought I was going to be a Ravenclaw for sure. His younger brother is a Hufflepuff, which is great, and we're not so sure about their dad. He seems like a Ravenclaw, but he hasn't been sorted yet. Delight. That's the word I kept coming back to throughout those months of listening to the books together. It was utterly delightful to watch a dyslexic kid be completely absorbed in literature and see him realize that this literary world was his to share in too. Harry Potter itself is delightful. It's warm and good-hearted, despite the darkness that enters the wizarding world. And let's be honest, my delight was as much for me as it was for my son. I too entered the wizarding world with all its wonder and quirkiness, and yes, magic. I've been a little sad since we finished the series. I've moved on to other books, and my son is re-listening to Harry Potter on his own. So I was thrilled to be able to extend my delight in Harry Potter by listening to the Harry Potter and the Sacred Text podcast. I'd known about it for a while, but only let myself start listening once I'd finished the series. I didn't want any spoilers. The podcast is hosted by Vanessa Zoltan and Casper ter Kuile, both graduates of Harvard Divinity School. They've studied how to apply the techniques of spiritual reading of scripture to secular literature. In their words, they bring thought, reflection, and laughter to Harry Potter, not just as novels, but as instructive and inspirational texts that will teach us about our own lives. Part of the rationale for this, they say, is that reading fiction doesn't help us escape the world. It helps us live in it. Every time I listen to an episode of the podcast, I experience openings, connections, insight, and inspiration. Listening to Casper and Vanessa apply sacred reading practices to Harry Potter helps me live better in this world. And it has helped me be a better teacher of Torah. Listening to the podcast has made me more appreciative of the interpretive voices of my students. And lately I've been better at listening when they share their wrestlings with Jewish texts. As someone who delights in this treatment of Harry Potter, and also as a teacher of Torah, I find myself wondering, would it be possible to apply what Casper and Vanessa and producer Ariana Nettleman have done with Harry Potter to Scripture? In a way, it would be like coming full circle. Harry Potter in the sacred text gives sacred treatment to secular literature, and the result is a deeply spiritual, impactful listening experience. I would like to give viewers the chance to read Torah in that joyful, rigorous, creative, inclusive style that they have managed to make for the podcast. As I embark on this project, my hypothesis is this. For people who have never experienced the Bible as a text that they feel connected to, it might be possible to develop that sense of connection, or at least an openness to that sense of connection, by reading the Bible in the style of Harry Potter in the sacred text, using the scripture and reading methodologies of the podcast as a guide for reading the Bible. So let's jump in and test that hypothesis, starting right now with the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1. And here we are with Genesis chapter 1. Vanessa and Casper always do a recap of the chapter that they are reviewing in any given week. And I also want to provide you with a recap of the chapter of the Bible that I'm going to be talking about. So here we are with Genesis 1. And I should say that if you haven't read the chapter yet, you might want to pause this recording and go ahead and read the chapter. You don't have to, but it might be helpful to read the text as we're going and not just hear the recap. It's up to you. So Genesis chapter 1, a 6-point recap. First, this is the first story of creation. I say first story of creation because there are actually 2 stories of creation in the Bible, and the second one comes in chapter 2 of Genesis, which we'll see next time. But for now, this is the first story of creation. In the beginning, there was God, and the earth was an unformed chaos. God makes light, separating light from darkness, and calls the light day and the darkness night. And this is the first day. 5 more days follow, in which God makes earth and sky, the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the animals of land, sea, and air, and all kinds of plants. On the 6th day, God creates humanity in the divine image, both male and female. God blesses the humans, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and tame it, and hold sway over all other creatures." And finally, everything that God makes, God sees as good. At the end of the chapter, God sees all of creation, and God says, "It is very good." So after we recap the chapter, we're going to take a look at a particular theme and examine our chapter of the Bible through that theme. This is exactly what Vanessa and Casper do in the podcast, and I think it's a really good way of reading a text. And what I've decided to do is to match up the themes that I'm using with the themes that they've used in Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I have a feeling that if I were going to choose the themes, my themes would be too predictive or too obvious or not creative enough. They wouldn't elicit a creative reading, I think. So, for example, an obvious theme for the first chapter of Genesis might be creation or creativity. We see lots of creativity in Genesis 1, but it's actually not that hard to find. And I want to challenge myself a little bit more. And by using the themes that Casper and Vanessa have used in Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, I think I can actually challenge myself in a way that I might not otherwise. So I'm going to read this week's chapter, Genesis 1, through the same theme that they used in reading the first chapter of Harry Potter, and that is commitment. So the question is, where do we see commitment in Genesis chapter 1? So there's a difficulty here right from the start that we see because we are reading a text that is a little bit different from Harry Potter. Whereas novels like Harry Potter give us a well-constructed story or a well-constructed narrative written by a single author, the Bible's not like that. With the Bible, you don't always have a clear story. You don't always have a narrative. You're often dealing with a text that contains elements written by several different authors from several different time periods that have been redacted together by someone from yet another time period. So that's a challenge when reading biblical texts in the way that we might read Harry Potter. And in Genesis chapter 1, God is our only character. Yes, human beings are created in the chapter, and they will become characters in their own right soon enough, but they're not quite there yet in this chapter, and I think that goes for the animals as well. So when we look at commitment here in this chapter, we're really looking at it from God's perspective. So where do we find commitment in this chapter? One possibility is that God makes a commitment to this world that God is creating and to the creatures in it. Though, as we'll see later, perhaps God doesn't fully understand the nature of this commitment, and it will turn out that God has some regrets. This raises the question, I think, is creation always an act of commitment? And that makes me think to myself, when in my life have I made commitments that I didn't fully understand, yet nevertheless have had to honor? An obvious one for me is parenting, right? You make a commitment to your children when you have them, when they're born or when they're adopted, but you really have no idea what you're getting into. And yet you make the commitment to see it through no matter what. Another commitment that we see in this chapter is a commitment to language, which I think is kind of interesting. God creates through language. God doesn't wave a wand, like in Harry Potter. God doesn't wave a wand and create the world. God speaks the world into being, right? God says, let there be light, and there's light. It's not like God thinks, I think I want to make light. Poof, and there's light. No, God speaks the creation into being. Maybe we need to be thinking about a commitment to using language well, to using language in a way that's creative and not destructive. Perhaps another kind of commitment that we see in this chapter is that God commits to seeing things as good. Perhaps even God knows that the world that God has made is flawed, and yet God chooses to see the world as good, to see the good in the imperfection that is the world. The text could have said, God saw that it was perfect, right? But that's not what we have here. It says that God saw that it was good. And at the end of creation, looking around at everything in creation, God sees that it's very good. It's not perfect. Again, it doesn't say that it's perfect, but what's there is good. Another commitment that we see in this chapter is that here, not everywhere in the Bible, but at least here, God is committed to order. This chapter shows creation happening in an orderly fashion. Things are neat and categorized. There are different types of seed-bearing plants. Animals are classified according to habitat, right? Land, sea, and air. The days are numbered. And a final commitment that I see in this chapter is I see a commitment from God to spread divinity by creating human beings in the divine image. And to me, that's a really beautiful thing to think about. So that's, I think, where we see commitment in this chapter. So I want to move on to questions. I think it's really important to allow ourselves to ask questions as we read biblical texts. And so I want to share with you some of my questions about Genesis chapter 1. First, what did God think God was committing to at the start of creation, right? So that's along the lines of our theme. Was there a thought process involved? Did God really think things through, or did God just act impulsively? We don't have to have answers to these questions right away, though they might provide food for thought for later, but I think it's really important to just get the questions out there on the table. Next, why did God create the world? Maybe God was lonely. Maybe God had some other reason. Maybe God had a commitment to spreading divinity. I don't know, but that's the question. Why? Why did God start to do this in the first place? Did God learn anything from the process of creating the world? When we read that God saw creation and it was good, what does good mean to God? What was the gender of the first humans? The text says that they were created in the image of God, male and female, God created them. What does that mean? Did God create man and woman separately? Were they somehow created together in some primordial hermaphroditic being? We don't know. And finally, what are your questions? Maybe go back and read the chapter another time, or read the chapter again. But what are your questions about the text? Get in the habit of asking questions whenever you read a biblical text, because I think the more questions we ask, the better readers we're going to be, and the more we will become a part of a conversation between the text and ourselves and everyone who's ever interpreted a biblical text. So every week on Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, Casper and Vanessa apply a sacred reading practice to the chapter of Harry Potter that they are discussing that week. And it's funny because these practices were usually developed around the reading of scripture. And what Harry Potter and the Sacred Text does is it takes these sacred practices and applies them to secular literature. But there's something really wonderful about the way that Vanessa and Casper do these practices. I feel that they do them in a very open-minded, non-judgmental, and inclusive way. And I'd like to take that as we reapply the sacred reading practices to Scripture. And as with the theme of the week, I'm going to take the same sacred reading practice that Casper and Vanessa use on the podcast and apply it to the chapter of the Bible that I'm reading. So for chapter 1 of book 1 of Harry Potter, they used a sacred reading practice called Lectio Divina. And for me, reading the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, I am going to also use the practice of Lectio Divina. Now, this is a Christian practice and not one that I had encountered before listening to the podcast. It certainly has an echo of practices that I've encountered as part of Judaism. So what are the steps of Lectio Divina? So on Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, Lectio Divina has been tweaked just a little bit. On the show, it involves the choosing of a text randomly by flipping through the chapter and looking right down at where your finger points. And then once you've chosen your text, you follow 4 steps. Number 1, you look at the text from a narrative or perhaps contextual point of view. What's happening in the story? For biblical texts that are narrative, we can ask the same question. What's happening in the story? For biblical texts that aren't narrative, and there are plenty of those, we'll have to adapt and ask about context. We'll see how that goes. So if we're looking at a law, for example, what's the larger context in which our particular law is found, right? Legal texts are another kind of text that we find in the Bible. Number 2, allegory. What symbols and metaphors are hidden in the text? Number 3, reflection. How does this text speak to us in our lives today? And in the podcast, Casper and Vanessa ask how we can read the text in relationship with the theme of the episode. And finally, number 4, invitation. To honor the work that we've done so far with the text, we ask ourselves what actions we're going to take as a result of our reading. So here we go with practicing Lectio Divina. The verse that I picked for this first time that I'm practicing Lectio Divina is verse 20 of Genesis chapter 1, which reads, God then said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures. So what's the narrative context? It's the 5th day of creation, and so far God has made light and darkness, day and night, sea and sky, and sun and moon. This verse is the beginning of life. So what about allegory? What metaphors or symbols do we find hidden in the text? And I find that I was struck in this reading by the mention of water, particularly of water at this critical moment of transition between primordial chaos and the birth of living creatures. Water is a source of life, right? In a way, we all come from water. We know from science that the first microbial life on our planet was found in water, and that water supported all life on Earth for the first however many millions or billions of years of its existence. And like the biblical phrase, the waters of the earth over billions of years actually did bring forth swarms of living creatures. When scientists look for life on other worlds, they look for water. Another place in which, or another connection that I make to water is that before we're born, we ourselves are held in the waters of our mother's wombs. We will also see water figure prominently in the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and in the life of Miriam in particular. The baby Moses is saved from death by the waters of the Nile as Miriam watches over him. The people cross the waters of the sea to freedom. All right, so reflection. As I read this verse in relation to the theme of commitment, the word swarms jumps out at me. Sometimes when we make a commitment, we get more than we bargain for, and things can feel overwhelming. That word swarms implies not just a steady stream, but something massive and uncontrolled. Sometimes I'll have a new idea that seems really exciting, but then I'll realize how much work it will be to bring that idea to fruition, and I feel like I've unleashed swarms of new items for my to-do list. Sometimes that swarm feels so overwhelming that I give up before I've begun. And so finally, an invitation. What's this text inviting me to do? Well, in light of what I just reflected on, I'd say that maybe the verse is calling me to be more deliberate in the commitments I make, and perhaps also to working through that feeling of overwhelm that sometimes happens at the beginning of a new creative endeavor. Finally, it's time for blessings. At the end of every episode of the podcast, Vanessa and Casper offer blessings to one of the characters in the chapter they've just studied. I love what Vanessa says about the act of blessing. She says, "What I love about blessings is that I feel like when you bless something, you are tapping into your most vulnerable wish for someone. You are admitting that you have no power over something, and yet you are hoping with every fiber of your being." The blessings at the end of each chapter really are beautiful, sealing in a way the sacred nature of the whole enterprise. Vanessa has made the commitment always to bless a female character, and I'm kind of inspired by that. I think I'm going to make a partial commitment to do that as well, as a way of bringing out women's voices in the Bible. These voices are often missing or obscured, and so I want to do this as a way of bringing our attention to that which might be easily overlooked. But because I'm doing this series by myself and not with a partner, and because I want to be both expansive and inclusive, I don't want to say that I'm only going to bless female characters. I think what I'll do in the end is bless 2 characters in each chapter. Of course, this first chapter of Genesis presents an immediate challenge to this commitment, at least on the surface. First, as I said earlier, in one sense, God is the only character in this chapter. Another challenge, perhaps, is that in this chapter, God has no gender. While the Hebrew, and therefore most translations, uses male gender pronouns, we read in verse 27 that God created the human beings in the divine image, creating them in the image of God, creating them male and female. If the human, or humans, are created male and female, and if humanity is created in the image of God, we could say that God includes, but is perhaps not limited to, male and female. So in this chapter, separating male from female, at least in God, is a false construct. And so in the end, I'd like to offer my blessings to God for containing within God's self all the multitudes and potentialities out of which the world was created, and for bringing potential into being, even though in so doing, God brought imperfection into being as well. In offering this blessing to God, I offer it to all of us as well, in all of our inner multitudes and in all of our imperfections. May we all be blessed. One final word. In listening to the first episode of Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, I really appreciated Casper's blessing for anyone who is embarking on a new beginning, and I want to take that blessing into my heart as I embark on this project. So that's it for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you think you know someone who might be interested in studying Bible in this way, go ahead and share this video. I'd love to get the word out. I'll be back here next week looking at Genesis 2 through the theme of loneliness. Thanks so much for stopping by our channel hop. Don't forget to check out my fellow masterclass friends and subscribe to all of our channels. Their channel links are posted in the description below. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Jen Clayman, and my website is jenclayman.com. All those links are also posted below. Finally, my heartfelt thanks go out to Victoria Marie of Victoria Marie Designs. She is an amazing teacher and mentor, and I am so grateful to her for putting this class together, for challenging us, and giving us the opportunity to grow. Thanks so much. Bye.